I was 23 years old when the sickness came to our town. It was October, and the war in Europe was still grinding men into the mud, but for a few weeks that autumn, nobody talked about the war. We talked about the flu. We talked about nothing else. My name is Walter Briggs. I worked at the grain mill on the edge of Harlan, Pennsylvania, and I lived with my mother and my younger sister Ruth in a narrow house on Maple Street. My father had died of a heart attack 2 years prior, so it was just the three of us, and I was the one who kept things together. The first person I knew who got sick was a man named Clarence, who worked beside me at the mill. He came in on a Monday morning looking pale, his eyes red at the rims, and by Tuesday he had not come in at all. By Thursday we heard he was in the hospital. By Saturday he was dead. He was 26 years old and had never been sick a day in his life that I knew of. That shook me badly. You expected the old to go. You expected the weak. Clarence had been neither. Within a week, half the men at the mill were gone. The foreman, Mr. Garside, told those of us still standing to keep coming in. The grain did not care about the flu, he said. I remember thinking that was probably the truest thing he had ever said. I kept going in. I wore a cloth mask my mother had sewn from an old pillowcase. Most of us did. We looked like a crew of bandits operating a flour mill, and under different circumstances it might have been funny. Then Ruth got sick. She was 17. She had her whole life mapped out in her head the way young girls do. She was going to marry a boy named Harold from the next street over, and she was going to have a house with a garden, and she was going to grow tomatoes and roses side by side, which she claimed was the right way to live. She told me this regularly. I told her regularly that I did not care about her tomatoes. She fell ill on a Wednesday. By Thursday night her temperature was high enough that I sat awake in the chair beside her bed all night pressing cold cloths to her forehead. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, boiling water, wringing cloths, praying quietly in the kitchen when she thought I could not hear her. The doctor came on Friday morning. Dr. Hess. He was an old man who smelled of pipe tobacco and wore a coat that was always slightly too large for him. He looked at Ruth for a long time, listened to her chest, and then took me into the hallway. He said there was nothing to do but wait. He said it like a man who had been saying it all week and was tired of the words. He told me to keep her hydrated, keep her cool, and pray she came through the second day. He said the second day was the one that decided it. I asked him what decided it. He said he did not know. He said that was the honest answer, and he was too old to give me the dishonest one. Ruth made it through the second day. I did not sleep that night either. I sat in the chair and I talked to her even though she was mostly unconscious. I told her about the mill, about the strange quiet in the streets, about how old Mrs. Patterson down the road had put a black wreath on her door for her son who had died the week before. I told her I needed her to get better because I did not want to grow up in a house with only silence and our mother's grief for company. I told her Harold from the next street over was going to have to find someone else to marry his tomatoes if she did not pull through, and I said it like a joke but I meant every word underneath it. By Saturday morning her fever broke. I went downstairs and told my mother, and my mother sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not crying exactly. Something older than crying. Something that had been waiting in her for days to come out. Ruth was thin and pale for weeks afterward. Harold came to sit on the porch with her on the afternoons when she could manage the stairs, and I would watch them from the window sometimes, two young people sitting in October sunlight, not saying much of anything, and I thought that was probably the right response to surviving something like that. Just sitting in the light. Just breathing. 40 million people died in that pandemic. Maybe more. Nobody knows the exact number because nobody was counting carefully enough, and the newspapers were not allowed to report the full scale of it during the war years for fear of hurting morale. I read that years later and it made me furious in a way I could not fully explain. All those people died and the world looked the other way because it was inconvenient. Clarence is buried in the cemetery on the hill outside town. I went to his grave the following spring with my hat in my hands and stood there for a while. I did not know what to say. I am still not sure I know what to say about any of it. What I do know is this. The flu did not care who you were. It did not care if you were young or strong or had plans. It moved through towns like a wind that no wall could stop, and it took who it took, and it left the rest of us to figure out how to go on. Ruth married Harold in 1921. They did grow tomatoes and roses in the same garden. I visited every summer until I moved to Ohio for work, and every summer she would hand me a tomato off the vine and watch me eat it like she was proving a point she had made years before. She was right about the garden. I never told her that. But I think about those weeks in October 1918 more than I think about almost anything else in my life. The silence in the streets. The cloth masks. Dr. Hess in his too large coat telling me the truth when he could have told me something easier. The sound my mother made when Ruth's fever broke. The world moved on. It always does. The war ended a month later and everyone celebrated and the flu slowly receded and people went back to their lives, and within a few years you almost never heard anyone speak of it. As if it had been a bad dream that everyone had agreed not to discuss at breakfast. But it happened. Every bit of it happened. And the people it took were real people, with names and plans and gardens they would never plant. I think that is worth remembering. I think that is the least we can do for them.